Hey again! Today we're going to begin delving into the theory of evolution, since most people don't really know much about it other than the most absolute basics. We're going to go through it pretty much from scratch. There's a lot to cover though, so this is going to take a few episodes. By the time we're done though, you'll have a pretty good working knowledge of how evolution actually works and how you can apply it to your world to make it that much more interesting. This first episode, devoted to evolution, is going to cover the most basic concepts, and then we'll go through the evolutionary process over time and create some more nuanced stuff later. So, why cover this at all? I mean, evolution's only a theory, right? Well, it's also the single theory with the most evidence we have of any theory that exists. Yeah, gravity's only a theory, but you don't worry about randomly flying off into space, do you? The heliocentric theory is that the Earth revolves around the sun, yet you can see that if you just look up in the sky, so what's a theory? I've covered theories before, but let's review this. A scientific definition of a theory isn't the same as what most people call a theory. Generally speaking, most people use the term theory as scientists do hypothesis, and hypothesis is only the start of a theory. Your hypothesis is basically saying you have an idea of what might be the case. In our example of evolution, that means we have a hypothesis that plants and animals and all living things really follow a specific process by which they adapt and change over time. Note that at this point, we're not even questioning whether life adapts and changes over time. That's already a fact. Evolution, in the sense that most people understand it, isn't a theory. It's flat out fact. It's more than on par with the idea that if you jump in the air, you'll come back down again. That things are pulled down to the Earth's surface isn't in question either. That's also a fact. We know it happens. We know exactly how fast it happens as well. At 9.80 meters per second squared at the Earth's surface, with minor variations based upon the density and placement of mass within the Earth and how far from sea level you are and such. The point there is, the hypothesis for how gravity works has nothing to do with whether you'll fall back down if you jump. The hypothesis is detailing things like warping space-time in 11-dimensional space, with the graviton being the carrier particle for the force of gravity. The previous theory of gravity was Newtonian physics version, which said that objects just pull each other together, which was proven to be false. Objects don't directly interact with each other, but rather warp the space that other objects are situated in. So yeah, basically, gravity as a hypothesis was proven wrong. That doesn't mean that people randomly start flying off into space by jumping. So back to what a hypothesis is. It's just a defined guess at what people think is happening. To go from a hypothesis into a theory needs a hypothesis to start with, but it also needs a few more things to qualify as an actual theory. First off, it needs to be falsifiable, meaning if you make a claim that's impossible to prove one way or another, or to disprove it, it can't be a theory. A theory absolutely must be able to be defined in such a way that you can say, if we ran a given test, then if A happens, the hypothesis may be true. But if B happens, then it's guaranteed false, because B can't happen if it's true. Note that the phrasing there says, if A happens, it doesn't guarantee the hypothesis is true. It only says if the hypothesis is correct, then A would happen. You could have several different things which could cause A to occur, so it doesn't guarantee that the hypothesis is actually correct. And this is why theories are only theories. No theory can ever be 100% proven as actual fact, as that would require 100% of absolutely all information, all circumstances, every shred of data in the entire universe to be certain of it as fact. All a theory can ever do is be challenged repeatedly by saying it would be false if X happens, and finding out that X never happens. As soon as X happens, even once, and can't be explained by any other means, the theory is falsified and is no longer a theory anymore. So that's one major reason why evolution is only a theory. It's not possible to ever be anything more than a theory. The next part that's required to make a theory, well, a theory, is that it has to have a predictive model of some sort. Meaning, you have to be able to say, if the hypothesis is correct, then it predicts that X will happen. In the theory of gravity, this meant that there were several predictions made, such as what the orbit of newly discovered planets should be. And in fact, predictive models that said, according to the hypothesis, that this is how gravity actually works, there should be a planet found exactly here, based upon the way other planets act nearby, and specifically that the previous theory of gravity can't account for this planet's existence and or location. This is how we discovered Pluto, and is how we proved that the planet Vulcan didn't exist inside of Mercury's orbit. So, you need some pretty good evidence to even be considered for theory status. Remember, gravity is also only a theory, and we use it to predict all sorts of stuff with amazing accuracy on a regular basis. And evolution is vastly better defined than gravity is. We'll go into examples of such later on, but you kind of need a very good grasp of a lot of different stuff before most of the examples make much sense. So we'll be getting into that later on. For now, we know that a theory needs an initial hypothesis, a predictive model, and it has to be falsifiable. In addition to such, a theory needs to have lots of evidence, many different data points from many different fields of study. Evolution has an absurd amount of evidence pointing towards its validity, from everything from geology to archaeology to genetics to molecular biology, just to name a few different fields which support it. We're pretty much constantly getting bombarded with more and more evidence that the theory of evolution is correct, even when we're not even looking for it. We just constantly stumble across it all the time in what may have seemed to be completely unrelated fields of study previously. Anyway, the final major part of a theory is that its predictions have to be at least as accurate as the predictions of all other theories, which already have predictions in place. And any experiments which have been run, it must be 100% accurate with predicting the results. Meaning, if anyone has ever run any experiment before, the theory absolutely must agree with the results. If the experiment would have disproven the theory, then it's not a theory. If another theory which already exists does a better job of predicting outcomes than the new theory, it's also not a theory. So yeah, evolution is only a theory isn't really a criticism of evolution. Being classified as a theory is pretty bloody hard to do. And for evolution to be the single best defined theory with by far the most evidence towards it compared to any other theory in the history of humanity. Yeah, that's saying something. So, again, the basic concept that creatures change over time and turn from one species into many different new species is not a theory. That part's fact. We already know it to be true. What the theory of evolution is exactly how evolution actually works. There's no question that we get from point A to point B. It's just a question of exactly how we're getting to point B. Yeah, I know this is kind of repetitive and annoying, but we seriously need to clear that stuff up before we even get into what evolution is, because it's so commonly misunderstood what evolution even is, or what a theory is for that matter. So, you may be asking, how can we evolve from monkeys if monkeys still exist? Well, yeah, that's a common question, but it's the wrong question to ask and shows that you don't know what evolution is. So let's get into that right now, shall we? The basic concept here is that if you have an isolated group of living stuff, then it will randomly mutate and change. The vast majority of these mutations will be detrimental, and will wind up getting the creature or plant or whatever which developed them killed off. For brevity's sake, yeah, that's ever mattered to me before, I'll just focus on creatures here. So, if a mutation is negative, it'll wind up with fewer creatures being able to breed and produce offspring. If you die before you have kids, it doesn't matter what the mutation is, it won't get reproduced. If the mutation happens to be beneficial towards the end of producing more children, no matter how that may present itself, then the chances are good that the mutation will show up more frequently in the population, until it becomes pretty much universal. Now, this is pretty important to understand. This is only an averaging effect over a long period of time. Stuff which is beneficial tends to stick around for a long period of time. Stuff which is detrimental tends to be weeded out after a while. Small, tiny changes may take a long time and many, many different generations to produce a noticeable effect. For a case study, if we look at something like lizards in deep underground caves where there's no light, they originally had eyes. You can pick through their DNA and see, oh, hey, there's genes in here that describe how to make eyes, but those genes are dormant and don't work anymore. What happened is that the lizards which had eyes had to expend energy and nutrients on building those eyes. It took more food to grow eyes than lizards which didn't grow them, or which grew deformed smaller eyes, or ones which lacked important parts to make the eyes work. This meant that, on average, over a long period of time, a lizard which produced eyes which sucked as eyes, but which cost less food to create, was less likely to starve and more likely to be healthy and strong in other ways, because lizards with working eyes didn't get any benefit out of them. As these lizards were deep underground and isolated from other lizards above ground, they were able to independently adapt to their specific environmental conditions. The lizards above ground still have eyes. They still have use for their eyes and can benefit from them, and the benefit gained from having eyes leads to them being better fed on average and surviving longer to produce offspring than those lizards which don't have eyes. The ones below ground, in deep caves, are entirely separated from breeding with those above ground. They're two separate groups in two separate conditions, and as such, it's possible for them to diverge into two separate species. As such, just because a new species of lizards without eyes evolved, it doesn't magically make the previous species of lizard with eyes disappear. Yeah, if there were only one small breeding group where the genes would be transferred universally among those present, then yeah, the entire group would tend to change over time. And the previous species would go extinct usually. If the only lizards in the world existed in that underground cave, then the lizards with eyes would no longer exist. But that's the thing about evolution. As long as you separate the breeding groups from one another somehow, they can diverge into new species. So yeah, humans didn't evolve from apes nor monkeys anyway. We share a common ancestor in the distant past, which is now extinct and happened to branch out in several different directions because there were several different groups which were isolated from each other and found themselves in different conditions, which allowed their various random mutations to proliferate. So the question of how can we evolve from monkeys if monkeys still exist isn't really a valid question in the first place because, well, we didn't evolve from monkeys in the first place. But even if we did, there's no reason that monkeys would have gone extinct anyway, just extirpated, meaning one region of monkeys would have disappeared as they changed into a different species, but any other monkeys that existed in the world that weren't in breeding contact would still exist unless they were also locally extirpated. A local extinction rather than a global extinction, if you will. Anyway, so, to go back to that thing we covered earlier, the genes which produce more offspring consistently over time tend to carry on is described rather clearly by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. This was a revolutionary concept at the time it was introduced, and it involved a lot of backlash at the time. But it makes a lot of sense. Basically, it describes all living creatures as merely being gene replicators. If a creature fails to replicate its genes, it gets discontinued. Those which replicate the genes become very good at doing so. What this means is that if you had a really weird random mutation that, I don't know, let you live to be 1,000 years old, that'd be really good for you as an individual. But that same gene also made you sterile, so you physically couldn't have kids. It would die with you as well. It wouldn't enter into the gene pool. You'd never produce offspring which also share that gene, so it wouldn't become something that happens to show up within the species over time. It doesn't matter how good your genes are. If they don't increase your chance of making copies of the genes, they're a genetic dead end. As such, the selfish gene is one which only cares, in an anthropomorphized manner, about itself. If the gene doesn't benefit via replication of that gene, it doesn't matter how beneficial it is to the creature that has that gene, it won't have any effect on increasing the likelihood that the benefits will be carried on. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't happen. Let's take that same example, a gene where you basically live 1,000 years old, but nothing changes otherwise. Women and men both basically run dry in humans after a while and no longer are capable of producing offspring anymore. So this immortality gene, as we'll call it, doesn't naturally produce more children than it would otherwise. It doesn't see a wide distribution within the population because people with this immortality gene don't have more kids than anyone else. However, just because it doesn't have an immediate benefit doesn't mean it gets removed either. It isn't really harming anyone, so it just kind of sticks around within that very small percentage of the population. No big deal. This means it has time to wait around until it can piggyback off other genes. Let's say that one of the small number of people with this immortality gene just also happens to also mutate a gene that lets them produce twins every time they have kids. They basically produce about twice as many children as anyone else. Well, sorta. About 1 in 8 births are twins actually in humans, but usually one twin absorbs the other in the womb. But for this example, we'll say both twins are born every time. And what this means is that the one individual with both the immortality gene and the twins gene will now make more kids than other people, meaning their kids will become more numerous and also have that immortality gene. In this manner, the gene proliferates because it piggybacked onto another gene along the way. We see this happening with negative genes as well. There's only a few ways to do something right, but an infinite number of ways to do something wrong. As such, most genes are going to suck. You know that kid who was deadly allergic to peanuts? Yeah, that seems a lot more common these days, doesn't it? That's because it's a lot more common these days. The fact of the matter is, severe allergies to commonly occurring triggers tended to kill those people off before they lived long enough to have kids. You didn't get many people who passed on the peanut allergy genes because, well, they were dead before they were old enough to have kids. Nowadays we have much better medical technology, and a lot of these people who would have otherwise died now live long, full, healthy lives and can have lots of children, which is great for them as individuals, so yay! But it also means there's now more children being born with deadly peanut allergies because their parents didn't die. They live long enough to have a child who also inherited this bad gene, or, any of a number of other negative genes. To put it bluntly, nature runs a eugenics program. It doesn't matter if you like it or not, it simply is what it is. And what it is a program which weeds out negative genes. By bypassing this rather heartless, cruel eugenics program with medical technology, we've literally weakened the human race. Our immune systems aren't remotely as good as what they were even a few centuries ago. Think about, a kid in King Arthur's court or other such tales going back in time. Yeah, they would have realistically died in about a month just because of the conditions they would have been exposed to back then. We are getting taller, we're getting stronger, we're getting smarter. Not by much, but we are getting smarter. But we're also getting fatter, and weaker immune systems, and all sorts of genetic diseases are being carried through which wouldn't have existed a few thousand years ago because they would have been weeded out by natural selection in the evolutionary process. We've basically got a gardener who thinks weeds are beautiful, has been actively planting dandelions, which are sucking up all the nutrients the other flowers need to survive. And the gardener's fixing the problem by just adding more nutrients to the soil. The problem there is that more nutrients to the soil go predominantly to the weeds, not the flowers, which grow even bigger and stronger than before, while the other flowers only barely survive, and eventually this is going to turn around and bite us in the collective genetic butt. Basically, we're talking a plague which will wipe out like 50% or more of the population before we find a cure to it. It's not even a matter of if, but a matter of when. Sooner or later, we're screwed. And a lot of people are gonna die. Yeah, that survival of the fittest thing isn't a joke, but quite much so a reality. The thing is, what defines the term fittest anyway? Well, the dinosaurs were the fittest creatures at the time for the conditions they were in. But then those conditions rapidly changed with a rather large meteor impact. The meteor kicked up huge amounts of dust into the air and blotted out the sun for quite a few months to possibly years. the oxygen content in the atmosphere decreased, a bunch of other effects all took place in a chain reaction, and, well, the dinosaurs were only the fittest in the previous conditions of the world. In the new conditions, they kinda sucked. And then they went extinct because they weren't the fittest anymore. In fact, they weren't particularly fit at all in these new conditions. The term survival of the fittest is reliant heavily upon what the definition of fittest means. And the fittest is only the most fit for that particular set of conditions. Being the fittest for a given set of conditions tends to make that creature exceptionally good in that one narrow situation, but as soon as the situation changes, they're not so good anymore. Hence why some scientists have started trying to use the term survival of the fitter instead. The implication being the creature which is fitter isn't necessarily one which is the best for that situation, but instead is the most adaptable to new circumstances. For example, raccoons and coyotes have adapted amazingly to city life, and there's been an enormous population explosion within the big cities because of such. Raccoons in particular aren't exceptionally fit at any one particular environment, but they do very well in many different ones and can adapt very quickly. As such, where other species die off when the situation changes, that just leaves behind the raccoons who are perfectly capable of surviving in the new situation, and because they're the only ones left alive, they win by default as the fittest creature around. Anyway, there's a ton more stuff to cover about evolution. Like, we've only ever so barely scraped the surface, and yet this is a pretty lengthy video. I tried to warn you, this is gonna take a while. Don't worry though, it'll be worth it, because the principles you're going to learn over the coming months, or hours I suppose if you're just viewing this like a few years from now and watch the evolution series back to back, these principles will allow you to create a vastly more interesting flora and fauna for the worlds you create. And the same principles also apply to culture in a lot of ways, so it's important to understand this before we get into culture generation for your world. For the moment, I could give you homework, but this has been long enough of a video already, so I'm not going to. Just think about what's been covered and how you can make use of it for now. Anyway, with that, I'm out. I'll see you next time.